Do you ever just remember that you have free will? Well, I did a few months ago, and now I'm in Chicago currently, and I'm checking out some museums and also various spots relating to my favorite book series of all time, the Dresden Files. This video is obviously not the usual fare for my channel. I usually talk about museums and niche historical topics, which we will have a little bit of both of those throughout this, but consider this as bonus content. If this is your first time here though, please do check out what other videos I create and be sure to subscribe and maybe consider sticking around if you like what you see. So this all started over the summer when I got hurt a lot. I fell off my bike, I broke my ankle, and I was having just generally a really miserable time. And so I thought that picking up the Dresden Files would be a great way to kind of keep myself company, because the main character in this series gets beat up a lot, and I was currently recovering from the world beating me up a lot, so it felt like it would be good company, and I was right. But this trip really began to come together when I stumbled across something called the Virtual Little Chicago, which is a reference to something in one of the books, but also a Google map that someone put together of where various events in the story take place all around the world, but of course, primarily Chicago. And so here I am in Chicago, checking out some of these places and just generally nerding out, having a good time. I've got a hit list of all the places I want to visit, a Ventra pass that's good for 7 days, and a good pair of walking shoes. So let's go. On my first full day in Chicago, I took the Red Line up to Graceland Cemetery, which I was really excited about, not just because of the Dresden Files connections, but also because I just love a solid historic cemetery. Graceland features pretty prominently throughout the book series, but I think that what made it so cool to visit was the specific graves that Jim Butcher mentions. The graves inside range from simple plots with simple headstones to life-size replicas of Greek temples, Egyptian obelisks, mammoth statues, even a pyramid. It took me some time to find one of the entrances, as the cemetery is surrounded by a large fence, but when I did, there were two notable graves I wanted to find. One was that of Inez Clarke, who, according to the handy self-guided tour pamphlet that I picked up, is still kind of shrouded in mystery. The pamphlet talks about how she possibly died when she was struck by lightning, and how sometimes her statue disappears when it's stormy out. In Graceland, there's a statue of a small girl, a child known as Inez. It's been there for going on 2 centuries, and every few years, stories will circulate about how the statue will go missing. As an aside, I spoke with many locals while I was in Chicago, and everyone was so kind. I spoke with a couple in front of Inez, and they were so sweet and excited to share Graceland with me, so thank you to everyone who spoke to me when I was in Chicago. You guys are great. The other grave that I visited was that of Dexter Graves. A hooded, haunting statue called Eternal Silence adorns this grave, which appears, I believe, only once in the series in Ghost Story. I really enjoyed my visit to Graceland, and if you're ever in Chicago, I highly recommend it as it's very quiet, historical, and free. If you do visit, please bear in mind though that this is still an active cemetery. There were fresh flowers on some graves, and whenever I visit a historic cemetery, I do so with the intent to learn and be respectful to the dead and those who mourn them. From there, I hopped on a train and headed to the American Writers Museum, which is not mentioned in the Dresden Files, but still felt very relevant, as the whole reason I was in Chicago is because of an American writer. They also had a game writing exhibit on called Level Up, which was really cool, and I'm considering doing a review of that and the entire museum. So let me know if that is something you would like to see, and I will start working on it. Overall, this was a great museum, and I even got to type out one of the more iconic Harry Dresden lines out onto one of their typewriters while I was there. And if you find yourself in Chicago, you should definitely visit. On my second day in the Windy City, I was feeling pretty run down, so the only thing I scratched off of my self-guided Dresden Files tour was purchasing a sprinkle donut. I didn't do anything else Dresden related on day 2, but on day 3, I hit the ground running, despite the fact that it was pouring rain. I started my day at a statue called the Cloud Gate, otherwise known as the Bean, where a lot of really sad things happen in the most recent book in the Dresden Files. The Bean was technically the first thing I saw in Chicago as I went on the evening that I arrived, but I wanted to see it during the day too, and I know people make fun of it, but I do think it is a very neat statue, and seeing the skyline reflected against it was kind of cool. Being beside the Bean and thinking of everything that happens in Battleground was quite sobering, however. From the Bean, I walked down to the Art Institute of Chicago, which I actually forgot also has a brief cameo in the series, or at least one of the lion statues out front does, as it comes to life due to circumstances. I did go into the Art Institute, had a blast. I stuck primarily with the American artists as I was in America, and I figure I better focus my efforts there. But after that, I decided to continue my soggy trek down Lakeshore Drive to the Shedd Aquarium. The steep 40 USD price tag made my eyes water, so I didn't end up going in, but if I'd had one more full day in Chicago, I probably would have gone. The next thing I had planned was just Lake Michigan. Until this point, I hadn't been close enough to the water to actually see it, so I went around the lakeside portion of the aquarium. I would have loved to have gone out to a beach or something, but I was pretty drenched by this point and getting pretty tired, so I decided that this little piece of Lake Michigan was good enough for me. It was a choppy, dreary day, but it was kind of perfect. The island called Demonreach doesn't actually exist, but with the dense mist and fog, I could imagine it sitting out there menacingly, just out of sight. By this point, I was thoroughly soaked after several hours of walking, and so I seriously debated with myself whether or not I should go to the Field Museum, but I figured that they would have benches and I could cross another item off my list, so I went in. I was, of course, on the hunt for the Tyrannosaurus Rex, known as Sue, the star of Deadbeat, in my opinion, but it took me a little while to find her. I thought she would have been in the main hall, as I believe that's where she used to be on display, and also where she is in Deadbeat, but she has an exhibition space entirely dedicated to her these days, so go Sue. There she is. I have to admit, I've actually seen Sue before. She was at the Royal BC Museum, I believe last year, but when I finally laid eyes on her for the second time, I was once again shocked at how rotund she is. In the book, I think it was assumed that the entire skeleton was on display together, but I learned that her skull is actually displayed separately as it was deformed by the fossilization process. There were also a bunch of her other bits on display too, separately, and the field also has this part of the exhibit where you can watch paleontologists chisel dinosaurs out of the rock, which was really neat. I took a rest here and imagined the various parts of the books happening around me before I realized I was stalling my return to the damp outside world and really ought to head out. On my final day in Chicago, I was set to fly back home in the afternoon, which gave me some time to check out the final spot on my Dresden Files self-guided tour. St. Mary of the Angels Catholic Church, a bastion in the books that frequently sheltered a scruffy wizard and his friends. The author often describes this church as taking up an entire city block, but I don't think he ever mentions how there's a parking lot in the center or a school to one side, so the actual church bit was smaller than I expected. Don't get me wrong, it is still massive, it is still beautiful, but my imagination definitely took his words in a different direction. The neighborhoods around the church, including Booker Park and Bucktown, were also very nice to walk through and reminded me a bit of Vancouver. These books are really close to my heart, even more so now that I've been able to come to Chicago, a place I might not have ever come to otherwise. I hope that if you're a fan of the books like me, this video was fun for you to watch, and if you've never read the books, give them a shot. They're not perfect, but I love them. I love the characters, and they're definitely worth giving a read. In the very slim chance that Jim Butcher is watching this, good job, man. Thanks for creating such a fun, gut-wrenching, edge-of-your-seat series. Someone very important to me recommended the Dresden Files back in, I think, 2016, and now, regardless of how the story ends, or if it ever ends at all, it's still got a special little bookshelf in my heart. And hey, if you need some descriptive canon fodder, feel free to include a Canadian ginger getting disemboweled by a Denarian or something. Thank you for watching and coming along with me for this. I, of course, had a lot of fun on my trip, but this video was also really fun to put together, and I hope you all enjoyed it. I probably won't make another video like this ever again, but who knows? Maybe in a few years I'll return to Chicago to see some new places mentioned in future books. I hope that wherever you are, people are really nice to you and you have a wonderful day or evening and everything goes your way, and I will see you next time.